Well, there's a new ebook on the market, and it's called The Politics of Abundance: How Technology Can Fix the Budget, Revive the American Dream, and Establish Obama's Legacy. The co-authors are both former FCC officials. Reed Hundt is the former chairman of the FCC in the Clinton administration, and Blair Levin spent many years there, most recently as part of their national broadband plan, the executive director. Gentlemen, thanks for being on the Communicators. Mr. Hundt, your book's subtitle: How Can Technology Fix the Budget and Help Us Over the so-called fiscal cliff?
Well, that is the subtitle. It's a bit of a mouthful, but the fundamental idea here is if you spend time in Silicon Valley, if you spend time in Detroit where the automobile industry is being rebuilt, if you spend time outside the Beltway, you feel that America has the potential to generate abundance for its own citizens and for the world. If you spend time only inside the Beltway, it looks like a zero-sum game. It looks like lose-lose, and who's going to lose the most is the gist of the negotiation. So what we tried to say in this book is, what are the lessons of the technology sector? What are the lessons that come from the optimism in the technology sector, and how can they give us some ideas that we could pass into law here in the United States, here in Washington, D.C.?
Blair Levin, you talk about two different platforms in your book, The Politics of Abundance. What are those platforms?
The basic idea is, how do we drive abundance by looking at areas where that can absorb a lot of private capital, where private capital wants to go into, where government has appropriate levers, and that can drive productivity not just in those sectors but throughout the entire economy. And the two that we're really focused on are what we call the power platform. The energy grid needs to be redone, and the knowledge platform. We need to do some work on the networks of what we call knowledge, but which is to say broadband. But it's really about how do we apply it? How do we deliver bandwidth that can really change education, change healthcare, change all government services, so we get faster, cheaper, better. The same kind of phenomenon that we see on our phones and in our networks, we want to see in public goods and services like education and healthcare.
Well, as a former executive director of the National Broadband Plan, Mr. Levin, how important is speed when it comes to improving our economy, in your view?
It depends on a variety of different uses. For example, in medicine, we're now moving to a place where we can have wireless sensors really improve medicine, and that's great. But when we come to business uses and some other things, if we want to incorporate 4K cameras, if we want to do genomic medicine, we need much faster networks. And it was interesting the other day, Bill Clinton, the former president, was at Dell World, and he was saying, we can't really expect our businesses to compete internationally if they only have access to speeds a fourth the speed of Korea, and he's absolutely right.
Reed Hundt, energy is included in your book on technology. Why?
To quote the Smashing Pumpkins, we all know what we're after, we just have to get there faster. We all know that we need a clean energy economy, that where it's really, really cheap to buy the energy, and where the energy that you're buying is not polluting the atmosphere. It is not causing greenhouse gases that are driving up the temperature and producing droughts. It is not producing a number of other health-related effects from air pollution. We all know this. We know what we're after. How are we going to get there? The way we describe it in the book is it's pretty simple. Could you have the federal government buy all the new things that are necessary and then give them away? It's not practical. It's not going to happen. We don't have that capability in the federal government to add to the deficit. So you have to open the door to private investment to do this job of rebuilding the power platform in the United States.
And the technology aspect of that is?
The technology aspect is manifold. In the last 4 years alone, the solar industry has gotten on what they call a Moore's Law curve, meaning price performance improves by roughly 2 times every 18 to 24 months. In the last 4 years, we've gotten ourselves in an innovation cycle in batteries so that by the end of 2020, electric vehicles actually will be price competitive with gas-driven cars. The problem with these things is that we can't wait. We can't wait because of the environmental effects, and we can't wait because we need the economy to grow quickly right now. So the book lays out a whole bunch of different ideas for bringing private investment much, much more quickly into the job of rebuilding the power platform.
Reed Hundt, recently on this program, James Glanz of the New York Times was on. He's written this series on some of the internet power plants, and he doesn't necessarily agree that the internet is completely green or is terribly green. What's your thought on that?
Well, he's right about that. People say the data centers in the United States account for 2% of all electricity consumption. If it isn't exactly that number, it certainly is the biggest single new additional element of demand in the whole electricity area. And where do they put data centers? People are talking about putting them in Finland or Canada or on the shores of major rivers because they want the atmosphere to be really cold and they want the electricity to be really, really cheap. They're trying to deal with the engineering demands of data centers. Those are stopgap solutions. In the long run, what we need is a clean energy platform that includes, as the president often says, all of the above. Lots more natural gas, lots and lots more solar, more wind, better transmission systems. But here's the beauty part of it. It all will require $1 trillion of private investment. And because of technological breakthroughs and new financing ideas, the electricity at the other end of the change will actually be lower priced than electricity today.
If I could just add, when we started the National Broadband Plan, we started with the question, what are some key problems that could be potholes in the information highway? What are some things we should worry about? And one of the interesting things I didn't anticipate was a number of companies that really want to deliver great connectivity and great applications are very worried about this very problem, about the amount of power it takes to run these data centers. Turned out that was beyond the scope of the broadband plan, which was pretty broad, but it's absolutely a concern of everybody. And so we need to do things like what Reed has been working on over the years, like what we propose in the books to enable it. But the other point is, it is green to deliver goods and services using bandwidth and chips instead of atoms. And so there's a lot of things in the economy where we know this is where the economy is going. We want to do it faster, but we also want to do it in a sustainable way. And the United States should want to lead in how we do that.
Mr. Levin, in the politics of abundance, there are several instances where you say the president could act on his own without congressional approval. What are some of those instances?
Well, we lay out, for example, in the area of education, I think the Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, has done a great job laying the foundation, and now it's just a question of how do we accelerate it. And we lay out certain things where the president, working with the Department of Education, could, for example, create a data exchange system which allows us to both digitize and personalize education. Very similar kind of thing in healthcare. And so there are all kinds of different things that the president, using executive authority, as in fact they have laid the foundation for already, could act to really accelerate that movement toward the digital platform.
Where does Congress come in?
Well, Congress comes in a number of places, and we lay out in the book, at the end of the book, 4 trades that we really think Congress should take part in. I'll mention one that's very related to the broadband area. There was a high-tech CEO council that suggested that there's $1 trillion of savings if the government moves all of its goods and services to the digital platform. What we propose is a base closing-like commission where you get those CEOs in the room, you make them look at it, those problems, and have very specific solutions, and then basically give Congress an up or down vote on what to do. In order to do that, you have to be able to use some of the savings in the out years up front to buy new equipment, which is more efficient and things like that. I also think that we need to make sure everyone in the country is online. In other words, if we're going to move all of government services to the digital platform, which we really want to do, we can't leave anybody behind. So that would be one where I think congressional authority is necessary. But there are some others that maybe Reed.
Well, here's some other examples. Let's take corporate tax. It seems likely that there will be a year-long debate about corporate taxation here in Washington in the year 2013. Most businesses are global in some respect now. Not all, but most big businesses for sure. If you're a big business and you look over to China, you'll see in their 5-year plans in energy or in information technology specific promises to have a 15% corporate income tax rate. You come to the United States, you have no predictability, you don't know what it is, and the current rate is much, much higher than that. We need reforms that say to businesses, we want you to invest here in the United States. While we're having this big debate about corporate tax reform, let's include in it specific reforms for the energy sector that in fact are designed to attract a massive amount of new investment to build a clean energy platform. Let's have that be a subpart of the corporate tax reform debate. Another example of the carbon tax. The carbon tax is a broad-based tax that does not, in fact, have to have a big impact on consumers. It could be placed on electric utilities. It could be something they avoid by moving to clean energy so that they wouldn't have to pay it. But if we had that carbon tax, it would, for a while, help close the deficit, and it would be a stimulus to the utilities to move to clean energy. So that's the second idea. And the third, many states now are following the lead of Connecticut, which is the first state to have created a state green bank, an institution that couples with the private sector and finances distributed solar or wind or electric utility grid rebuilds or energy efficiency measures, depending on the state. Let's have the federal government loan money to state green banks at the extraordinarily low rate that the federal government currently borrows at. So these are a handful of different ways to provide a financing support and a tax policy support for massive private investment.
Reed Hundt, to achieve some of the goals in the politics of abundance, what's the role of the FCC?
Well, the FCC can take the lead on a handful of topics, and as Blair said, on many other topics, it should provide policy ideas that Congress and the executive branch will need to work out together. An example of what the FCC can do is it can reform the E-rate, the program that we were involved with back in the 90s, so that the things that school districts and libraries buy under the E-rate are closer in description to modern technology and are really not just the old things that aren't as efficient as the modern technologies permit.
Blair Levin, in your book, you spend quite a bit of time comparing today to the Clinton-Gore era, right, and what occurred in the 90s, what worked, what worked.
Well, what worked was that there was this massive private investment starting really in the middle of the decade that, to a surprising degree, drove surpluses in the federal government budget. And as George Will recently pointed out, it was really the internet that drove that wonderful period where we weren't arguing about falling off a fiscal cliff, rather we were arguing about what do we do with the surplus. And I think that that lesson is a lesson that you can actually see at various other points in history. Wherever you have economic growth, it's often due to the fact that there's essentially a technological change going on. So we add railroads, we add steel, we add cars. What was great about the 90s was, you know, in part because, frankly, I think some of the policies that we adopted, but really there was a wonderful consensus in the federal government about the deregulation of the telecommunications sector that I think worked extremely well. There was an understanding that this was a sector that can help drive growth. And what we've tried to say is what were those lessons of that time? And it's really about how do we unleash private investment? How do we get rid of the rules that may have made sense 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but don't make sense now? But also, how do we deliver public goods and services better for all Americans? And that was what really, asking that question of each other was what led us to want to write this book.
Well, Blair Levin, given what you just said, and what's your take on what the ITU is doing right now when it comes to the worldwide internet? Yeah,
well, the ITU just finished up their work. I can't say that I've had an opportunity to either examine it in detail in terms of the written product or have a chance to talk with a lot of friends who were over there to do it. I certainly, like a lot of other Americans, am very worried about countries that believe that what we need to do is regulate the internet more, or have countries essentially suppressing both the expressions of speech as well as the economics of what the internet can be. There are certain countries that want to protect certain industries and have ideas in mind to do that. So I would put myself as kind of nervous about that. I think we ought to be moving in a direction which, you know, is more about openness and economic growth and the free expression of ideas.
Reed Hundt, When it comes to the internet and the politics of abundance, your book, there is a real role for government. Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. Let's talk about the power grid for just a second. There's one thing that we don't know how to change. You can have a wireless industry and communications, but when you talk about wireless and electricity, that is called lightning. It is dangerous. It is not a consumer product. You have to recognize in the electric grid that there's a local distribution network, those lines that go up down the street and reach your house, and they need to be owned by a company, and that company needs to invest to keep the trees from falling on these lines and to repair them and to deal with health and safety issues. And so we have to have that be the pivot point and not say, oh, well, that just isn't important anymore, right? But around that, you can move to a clean energy platform. There are more than 100 million buildings in the United States. On average, we ought to be having about $10,000 of investment for every one of the 100 million buildings on average to have it be that they consume less electricity and get the same heating and lighting and air conditioning. There are about 6 million businesses in the United States. Many of them, millions of them, ought to be able to have solar power on their roofs to provide their own electricity, because many of them have flat roof buildings, warehouses, buildings in a strip mall, grocery stores. They all should have solar power on their roofs. Even in cold, gray states in the far north, solar power can provide up to 15% of the electricity with appropriate financing at prices that are at or below the levels that exist today. So these changes around the electric grid are really easily possible if we just change the regulatory policies, if we change the financing policies. We don't have to have a massive overhaul. We don't have to have a nationalization of businesses. We just have to open the door by some regulatory measures and some deregulatory measures to what we can reasonably estimate to be $1 trillion of private investment.
What would you go ahead?
Well, I was
Mr.
going to
Levin.
say, and if you look back at history, there's always a role for a government when you see this kind of growth that we're looking for. Exactly 150 years ago, the Congress passed 3 laws, which I think if you consider how America became a leader in the world economy, it really goes back to those 3 laws. The Transcontinental Railroad Act, the Morrill Act, which created the public universities, and the Homestead Act. We took assets which were underutilized in terms of land, in terms of human capital, and we said we're going to find a way to utilize them. And that's kind of the inspiration for the kinds of things we're talking about now. How do we leverage what we have, which is so many great assets, to have another generation of American economic leadership?
Blair Levin, how ubiquitous is broadband in the U.S. right now?
Well, what we found in the National Broadband Plan is that by a definition of broadband, which is a current definition, it's always a moving target. There's about 7 million homes, which represent about 5% of the American homes, that don't have access to it. We can actually solve about 80% of that problem relatively easily. With there were some changes. The FCC should be congratulated. About a year ago, they made some changes which I think are going to accelerate that. But that doesn't solve a couple of problems. Number one, it doesn't solve the problem of how do we have economic leadership, how do we have the next generation of networks and the next generation of applications. We can't sit on our laurels, in other words. And so how do we have a constantly improving ecosystem? And there are a variety of ideas in the book about that. I also think that in the long run, those speeds aren't going to be fast enough for rural. So we're going to have to find, one of the things we propose in the book is to kind of have a race to the top for technologies that will use the asset that rural has, which is spectrum. There's a lot of extra spectrum in rural America to try to get to the speeds that are more similar to what urban folks benefit from.
Reed Hundt, you were the FCC commissioner who oversaw the first spectrum auction. Is that correct?
It's true.
Some spectrum auctions are coming up. Do they need to be more focused in your view?
No, I don't think so. I have to admit that my friends Ruth Milkman and Gary Epstein and Julius Chinikowski are running these auctions, and I think they're already doing a great job. No, I think that they don't need to be more focused. The idea of this auction, Blair put in the National Broadband Plan. It has drawn bipartisan support. You do have to be a game theorist as opposed to a mere lawyer to understand all the intricacies. But really the main thing is this is an example of how It's not that difficult to have really big, profound change once you really focus on it. What's the big change here? There are an awful lot of over-the-air broadcast signals that really are reaching almost no one from stations that have almost no audience and would be just as happy to be on cable TV. That spectrum should be used for smartphones. The change from the one to the other is tricky, to be fair to everybody involved. It's tricky, you have to strike a balance, but the change conceptually is pretty simple. And when it happens, you will see, this is in Blair's plan, you will see tens and tens of billions of dollars of new private sector investment created. That's the cool thing, right? Because the technology created the potential. Folks in government, they have to figure out how to open that door, which sometimes you do need a big key, and you need to figure out some tough combinations of the locks. But if you can just make those changes, then the investment will just pour into the new opportunity.
We are talking with former FCC Chairman Reed Hundt and former National Broadband Plan Executive Director Blair Levin about their book, The Politics of Abundance: How Technology Can Fix the Budget, Revive the American Dream, and Establish Obama's Legacy. One of the examples you put in your book is what's happening right now in Kansas City with Google. Are you supportive of that project? How does that project play into the politics of abundance?
So I don't work at Google. Let me give you my interpretation of it. They read Blair's broadband plan that said, why can't we have a 10x or 100x improvement in broadband? And then they said, well, let's just see if we can't demonstrate that in Kansas City. I think it's tremendous when a business empowers people in its own shop to have that kind of initiative. But as Blair will tell you, it is resonating in other cities and states as well, and they are following their own methods to get to very similar results.
That's right. Last week I was in Seattle with the mayor and the University of Washington announcing a gigabit deployment that I think will be, it's not as large as the Google deployment in Kansas City, but is similar in terms of scope. Chattanooga has a gigabit deployment. The mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, recently put out a request for information in which he said the city wants to deploy gigabit in various parts of its city so that we can be a leader in bandwidth delivered innovation in goods and services, and got a number of responses. A group that I work with, Gig.U, is working with a number of university communities to do that same thing. And we're talking to lots of different mayors who recognize broadband's not just an entertainment tool, it's really an economic development tool, and we're going to have bigger quantities. We're going to have faster, cheaper, better broadband if we want to be at the forefront of the next generation of innovation.
Well, you said you were in Seattle, Mr. Levin. What do you do today?
I'm sorry.
What's your job?
That's a good question. I'm at the Aspen Institute, but most of my time is spent with this Gig.U project, which came out of both the National Broadband Plan, but also when we noticed that when Google did a great thing for this country, I think, when they said, we'd like to try this, and then 1,100 communities applied. Well, that doesn't mean that all the citizens want to sign up for a gigabit, but it does mean that 1,100 communities recognized this is the future. We want to lead in that future. We want to have the great innovators come to our communities. And so our thought was, one company, one city is not enough. We need a critical mass, maybe 10, maybe 20. And which were the communities most likely to embrace this next generation? And we thought university towns were a good place to start, and so that's what I spend most of my time doing.
Is the project that Google is doing in Kansas City, is it economically feasible to do that nationwide?
I'm not sure it's economically feasible nationwide, but I think that there are a number of places where it is economically feasible. And part of what they've done very well, and you also got to give the city a lot of credit for this, as well as the state government, the county government, is they've looked at it as a problem of how can we utilize existing assets to lower the cost of deployment. And that's actually what Seattle did as well, and pretty much all the Gig.U communities. We have a project in Maine, a project in Florida, as well as already one in Chicago. And it's really about, can we utilize pre-existing assets better to bring more bandwidth at a lower price? And so I think that's kind of, in the short term, the idea to really get it going.
Reed Hundt, what is it that you are doing these days?
I'm on the board of a bunch of tech companies out in Silicon Valley. I run a nonprofit in Washington called the Coalition for Green Capital, which designs state green banks for states that want to do it. And then in the holidays, I'm in charge of thinking of events that are adequate to bring the children home to see their mom and dad.
And you're doing a great job of that.
I read in your biography, I read somewhere that you were the first FCC commissioner to actually have a computer on his or her desk.
Well, that's true. I'm the first to have made a cell phone call to Alaska. And I'm the first to have engaged in a lot of these things that are so familiar now that most people can't believe that the world ever didn't run this particular way. But what Blair and I, when we think about the 90s, what we're really proud of is, in the 1990s, everyone on every rung of the income ladder in the United States, they did better. All the income quintiles, everyone had income growth. The unemployment rate was at a record low. And the best thing was that young people were filled with a sense of opportunity. And if we could just have that be recreated, that everyone under the age of 30 would feel this is a glorious world and I can make an impact and I can be the hero of my own life, if we could get that, then America's future will be boundless.
When you look 10 years down the road, what do you see in the tech world, in the telecom world?
I am a huge optimist. 10 years down the road, I think we will have a substantially clean energy platform in the United States, that electricity will be cheaper, not more expensive, that we will, 10 years down the road, have seen about $500 to $600 billion of new private investment that has created 1 million to 2 million new jobs. I see inventions in batteries and in solar power and in the design of wind turbines and in the transmission technologies that they're actually right there being proved in labs, but they're not visible in the commercial world, but they will be 10 years down the road or faster. The only thing I see that is a caution of great size is this: we can't be patient about this. Climate change is real enough, dangerous enough, that we can't wait for the 10th year for these things. We have to be starting them all tomorrow.
Blair Levin, very quickly, same question, and then tell us where the politics of abundance is available.
What I see in 10 years is that every child has an opportunity to have a much better education because it'll be personalized, it'll be digital. Their parents will be able to will help them more. The teachers will have tools of situational awareness that will allow them to be better teachers. Same thing for medicine. We're going to have personalized digital medicine. Doctors will have greater ability to understand what's going on with the patients. The patients will have greater control over their own lives. As Reed and I age, a lot of these things are quite wonderful. We'll be able to stay in our homes longer and still have access to great medicine. I must say, I also think driverless cars will be great as we get older. So I'm very excited about that. Though again, I think, America never fails when it focuses, but we need to focus, and we need to focus now. The book is available on Amazon. It's an ebook, as well as some other e-sites that people go to. And whereas we certainly hope people buy it and read it, the most important thing is to get these ideas and ideas about how we grow, how we create a great future for the next generation into the policy debate right now.
Blair Levin, Reed Hundt, The Politics of Abundance, How Technology Can Fix the Budget, Revive the American Dream, and Establish Obama's Legacy. This is the Communicators on C-SPAN.
Tomorrow on Washington Journal, we'll discuss